arrived to the fourth day, and the psalm for today is Psalm 82. So, let us take a listen, shall we?
Good evening. We hope that you're enjoying the festival wherever you are. And I know that some are perhaps watching these messages who are out in British Columbia and Canada, and some who are in Kerrville, Texas. So wherever you are, we hope you're enjoying the festival. We're at the beginning of the third day of the week and the fourth day of the festival. We're here in Orlando, and one of the attractions of Orlando is SeaWorld. When you go to SeaWorld, you see why dolphins are more intelligent than people. In the space of 2 hours, they can train these people to hang around and just keep feeding them fish. Well, I have some material today that relates to the sea, but let's first go back to the title. I want you to focus that in order for our civilization to work, American civilization to work, we need ethical monotheism. We need to have a people who, and let's face it, in every society, people understand that you shouldn't steal from somebody else, you shouldn't murder somebody else, you shouldn't be dishonest. They have their philosophers and teachers, and they wouldn't want people to do that, to treat them that way. So people know generally that they ought to be ethical. It's really important to have a belief in one God, because that way you don't have a God for this profession, a God for that profession, a God for this country, a God for that country. There's one God for the entire humanity. It's a very powerful concept. And American civilization is based upon ethical monotheism. That is to say, the belief that we are ultimately accountable to a higher power. We'll see more about that as we go along. If we go back to the history of ancient Israel, a great empire arose in what is today Iraq, in the area of Nineveh, by the Tigris River, and it came to dominate the Middle East, and it became a very severe problem to the people of Israel. And during the time of Jonah, the prophet, Israel was restored to greatness to a degree. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom had a good relationship with each other, and they were generally doing well. And this is the time of when Amos prophesied, when he went from Judah to Israel to prophesy, because things were going relatively well, but the people were corrupt. They weren't appreciating the fact that God was being merciful to them. They continued to sin. But let's notice in 2 Kings 14:25 some of the good news that you would have seen if you were living in Israel at that time. He restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath as far as the Sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah. So Jonah was prophesying to that northern kingdom, and he told them they would win out. Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was from Gath Hepher. But he was an Israelite, but when God asked him to go to a Gentile country that was a potential enemy, he didn't want to do it. Now let's go back and understand the significance of this quote-unquote minor prophet. The one sign Jesus Christ gave of his messiahship was that he was an antitype of Jonah. But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Now there's more to this message than, of course, the greatest message is that we understand the burial, the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection. But there's a secondary message here, because Jonah preached to the Ninevites, and he told them, this is Jonah 3:4. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and he called out, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." So 40 days is a period of trial and testing, and God gave the Ninevites 40 days to repent. But in prophecy, there's a principle of 40 days for a year, a day for a year. And 40 years after Jesus Christ warned them about the prophet Jonah, 40 years later is when all the destruction occurred, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the exile of the Jews until recent times. So there's a secondary message there. 40 years later came the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the second temple by the Romans. And there's Jewish tradition that around 40 years before that time, many of the signs and miracles that used to occur at the second temple disappeared. There's even a Jewish tradition that for 40 years things were different. Those last 40 years before it was destroyed, some of the signs and wonders that had been there had disappeared. Let's go back to that scene. Here we have the book of Jonah, and I'm showing you this because on the Day of Atonement, the book of Jonah is read in the synagogues, and we realize that I could really bore you because you've heard them all, these various one-liners about Jonah. It is a very interesting story. Yeah. So it can be very entertaining, but there's also a lot to the book of Jonah, and it ties in with the Day of Atonement. Here's one example. "And they said to one another, 'Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. You remember the Day of Atonement. We cast lots to determine which goat is sacrificed and which goat goes to Azazel. And now another connection with the Day of Atonement. Fasting, repenting. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least of them. And then we do have the atonement. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. Now, let's connect this book to the Festival of Tabernacles. Jonah was sent as a prophet to the Gentiles. He didn't want to go. He was a patriot. He didn't want God to bless a Gentile nation that would be a potential enemy of his. He would try to run away. But, of course, God forced him to do what he had to do. But you notice that here the message is going out to Assyria. And in the millennium, Assyria will indeed be a very important ally of Israel, Isaiah 19. And notice what happened. The people who were on that ship, from various nationalities, it was a mixed crew. Some of us have been on cruises, and everybody on the cruise is from some other country. You know, it's very fascinating. And that's the way that crew was, evidently, of Jonah's ship. Notice what happened. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. What a witness to those people. So they're going to go home to their various countries and talk about it. And in verse 16, then the men feared the Lord. They feared Yahweh. They feared the God of Israel exceedingly. And they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So who knows what became of some of those people as a result, and their families. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. But you see, this became a witness to those people. So it's the beginning of the conversion of the Gentiles in a way. And this is verse 15, as we saw. And then there's another verse later on in the third chapter, in the fourth chapter, which I'll read. I'm not sure that I have it there. So let's. The thing is, the point is that Iraq, where he was, gets very, very hot. If you read about the country of Iraq, it can get really, really hot there. And Jonah was sitting up and to see what would happen to the city. And I want to go to verse 6. Verse 5. So Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city. This is Jonah 4 and verse 5. There he made himself a shelter. He made himself a booth, a sukkah, a temporary dwelling, and sat under it in the shade till he might see what would become of the city. So that kind of ties in that book with what we're doing. We're in a temporary dwelling as he was at that time. He built himself a sukkah, a temporary dwelling. And when we come to the end of the chapter, we see how God is concerned about humanity and even about animals, as Daniel pointed out recently. And God says to Jonah, and should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and much livestock? So when they repented, it was in order to become basically ethical people. You know, they're told by their king to cease from their violence. They were very violent and cruel people. So it was not a matter necessarily of all the ins and outs of what we understand God expects of us, but just a basic morality, a basic acknowledgement of God and basic morality. This is the bedrock of our civilization. Now, it's interesting, this analogy that I'm going to make between Jonah and the Apostle Peter. Jonah was sent to the Gentiles, and he didn't really want to do it. And Peter was kind of hostile towards Gentiles too. But he was one who began the church among the Gentiles. Simon Peter replied to Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah." Oh, he called him the son of Jonah. Maybe Jonah was like a type of Peter, a prophet of God who was maybe very concerned about his own people, a little bit suspicious maybe of others. But God said, "You go to the Ninevites." And he tells to Peter, "You're going to deal with these Italians when they come to you." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And now let's go to the book of Acts, and we see, well, let's first go to Jonah 1 and verse 3, because that also ties in with Peter. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish. Either he was going to Turkey or maybe even farther to Spain. From the presence of the Lord, he went down to Joppa, okay, the city of Jaffa, which is, it's an old city. It was there for many, many centuries. And then the Jews built a new city next to it, Tel Aviv. Now Tel Aviv is a huge metropolis, so Jaffa is a suburb of Tel Aviv. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. And here we see today a view of Jaffa as it is today. And guess where Peter was when he began to work with the Gentiles? And now send men to Joppa, the angel said to Cornelius. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon, who is called Peter. Now, let's go on to the next prophet, Micah. Micah, of course, expands on this theme of teaching the world God's ways, coming from Jerusalem as the capital of the world, the law going forth from Zion. It shall come to pass, Micah writes, and this is also found in the book of Isaiah, and most people probably associate it with Isaiah, but it's also here in Micah. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and people shall flow into it, or shall flow to it. And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And it goes on to talk about, as a result of that, a world of peace. He shall judge between many peoples and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree. So we have prosperity. And no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. This is a prophecy in Micah that it goes forward, projects forward thousands of years. And
this is the modern area, you said.
Yeah, this, I'm trying to think, this is Bethlehem, right? This is the way Bethlehem is now. And Micah has an interesting prophecy about Bethlehem, which was the city of David. He says about Bethlehem, which means house of bread, which of course Jesus Christ says, I am the bread of life, John 6:48. But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel. So here Micah prophesies, thousands of years before the birth of Christ, that Christ would be born in Bethlehem. And also the nature of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ is human, but also Jesus Christ is divine. The Word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. Notice what he says. I'll read the whole verse. But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. So he's more than human. And here you see Mount Zion as it is today. Someday this will be a center, spiritual center for humanity. This is very important in the book of Micah, a basis for our American civilization. He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you. What basically does God want out of us? Micah tells us 3 important principles. But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. To be fair to everyone, to be kind, and to realize that there is a higher power and you are going to someday be accountable. This is the basis of, as I said, of human civilization, particularly American civilization, because we have that heritage, that biblical heritage in this country. Let's go back to that. He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. Now, Jesus Christ gave the same teaching as he came to Jerusalem before his arrest and his and his crucifixion. He condemned the religious leaders of his day. Earlier we sang Psalm 82, a condemnation of the leadership. The fish stinks from the head, they say. Condemnation of the leadership. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe, mint, and dill and cumin. You're very technical about some of these legal matters. And have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. So the same thing, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God. The same principle here. You've neglected, he says to the spiritual leaders of his day, you've neglected justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. No, you don't. You aren't lax with the technicalities, but these basic principles, this is what must be stressed in society. Justice, mercy, and faith. The basis of what is so necessary in America and all around the world, ethical monotheism.
All right, to close, we're going to sing the song that Jonah sang from the belly of the fish, Jonah 2.
In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, to the heart of the seas. The currents swirled about me, your waves and breakers swept over me. I said I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. Engulfing waters threatened me, and the deep surrounded. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down, and the earth barred me in. But you, O Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to the worthless idols turn away from God's love to them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on this fourth day of the Festival of Tabernacles, and we will see you all tomorrow.